Well, if they don't work with him, then who else is there? Exactly, the communists. You think McCarthy would allow that? Yeah, the senator who talks about, communists and spies in the State Department. No, I don't know if there actually are any. Oh, gotta go. July 9th, 1950. The Korean War has not been going on for very long. The invasion of South Korea only began June 25th. But already this week, outside forces arrived to help the South Korean army, the Americans. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the advancing North Korean forces took Seoul, the South Korean capital. A bridge over the Han River was blown that killed hundreds of civilians. The North Korean advance continued everywhere, and the South's forces were routed, though the fighting was bloody and casualties were also pretty heavy for the North. The U.S. announced to the world that it would join the Korean War, and Douglas MacArthur began to assemble American forces to head over. As I said at the start, the Americans have now arrived in Korea, and this week they do join the battle. They do not acquit themselves well at all. See, the first combat troops to arrive, other than that AA unit I mentioned last week, are Task Force Smith. Last week on June 30th, MacArthur ordered Walton Walker, commanding U.S. 8th Army, to send William Dean's 24th Division to Korea. MacArthur commands the U.S. occupation of Japan, and 8th Army is stationed there, the closest American forces to Korea. Dean got his operational orders the first. They say that a delaying force of 2 rifle companies, backed by 2 mortar platoons and 1 M20 recoilless rifle platoon, are to fly to Busan and then report to General John Church for orders. The rest of the division will travel to Korea by boat. The mission is this: advance at once upon landing with delaying force in accordance with the situation to the north by all possible means. Contact enemy now advancing from Seoul towards Suwon and delay his advance. Dean is to take command of all U.S. Army forces upon his arrival in Korea. Over the next few days, 24th Division is brought up to strength and has 15,965 men and 4,773 vehicles. Charles Brad Smith commands the 1st Battalion of the 21st Infantry Regiment of the division, and his crew, minus A and D companies, flies out of Japan already July 1st. This is Task Force Smith. It's only a bit over 400 men, companies B and C, mainly under 20 years old, and only about a sixth of them have some combat experience. They would be the older ones who fought in World War II. They are greeted at Busan by cheering crowds, and the town is done up with festive banners and streamers. They take the train from there to Taejon, arriving July 2nd. That is where Smith meets Church, who points at a map and tells him, "We have a little action up here. All we need is some men up there who won't run when they see tanks. We're going to move you up to support the ROK and give them moral support." The ROK is the South Koreans. Right. Smith goes out to do some recon, and all along the road up to Osan, he sees thousands of refugees and ROK soldiers all making their way south. There aren't that many roads, and Korea is pretty mountainous, so the enemy heading south from Seoul basically has to take the Suwon Road towards Osan. Smith finds a good position a few kilometers north of Osan with a commanding view of both the highway and railroad nearly the whole way to Suwon. The afternoon of the 4th, Smith gets his orders to deploy his men at that position. A little after midnight, his men move out of Pyeongtaek. The South Korean drivers desert when they learn they're heading north, so Smith's men commandeer vehicles. Because of the blackout and the road choked with refugees, it takes 2.5 hours to cover 20 kilometers. But by 3 in the morning, July 5th, the delaying force is in position. The officers are confused because they thought they were going to meet up with an ROK military unit, but they're alone on the hill. It's also really hard to dig in because of the rocky ground. Welcome to Korea. But they lay phone lines to the battery of howitzers 2 kilometers to the rear. Only 6 of the 1,200 rounds of ammunition they have are high-explosive anti-tank heat shells. The rest are all regular high-explosive. At 7 a.m., Smith sees movement in the distance down the road. Soon enough, a column of 8 Soviet-made T-34 tanks appears, and at 8 a.m., the forward observers call the artillery for a fire mission. At 8:16, the first American artillery fired of the Korean War hurtled through the air towards the North Korean tanks. The artillery took the tanks under fire at a range of approximately 4,000 yards, about 2,000 yards in front of the American infantry. Shells began landing among the tanks, but the watching infantrymen saw the tanks keep on coming, undeterred by the exploding artillery shells. The recoilless rifles also do not damage the tanks, but the 2 lead tanks are stopped by heat shells. They pull off to the side of the road. 1 catches fire and 3 men emerge. 2 have their hands up and 1 has a submachine gun. He fires into an American machine gun position and kills the assistant gunner, who is likely the first American ground soldier killed in this war. Return fire kills the 3 North Koreans. Once the 6 heat shells are used, the Americans don't have anything that can hurt the tanks, and they just rumble through, not stopping to engage, but firing on their way past. They are followed by more groups of tanks, and by 9 a.m., 33 enemy tanks have passed Task Force Smith's position. They have cut the phone line back to the artillery, and soon enough are upon the artillery. The U.S. artillery does manage to immobilize the odd tank by hitting its tracks, but 29 of the 33 advance past the artillery, having destroyed all of the parked vehicles behind the infantry and killed 20 or so men. The blocking position has failed to do any blocking whatsoever so far. And then it goes quiet again. And then, after another hour or so, a column of trucks and infantry, some 10 kilometers long, and with 3 more tanks at the front, comes down the road. This is a major force. 2 regiments, the 16th and 18th, of the North Korean 4th Division, as it turns out. The Americans open fire on them with machine guns and mortars, blowing men up into the air and blowing them apart. North Korean infantry begins to scatter off the road into the paddies. The tanks drive up and return fire, suppressing the American positions as the North Korean infantry begins slowly deploying into the hills to make a double encirclement. Task Force Smith is on a front of under half a kilometer, and there is no infantry deployed behind them. So this is eventually going to end only one way. Around 2:30, Colonel Smith decided that if any of his command was to get out, the time to move was at hand. Large numbers of the enemy were now on both flanks and moving towards his rear. A huge enemy reserve waited in front of him, and his small arms ammunition was nearly gone. A large enemy tank force was already in his rear. He had no communications, and he could hope for no reinforcements. The weather prevented friendly air from arriving on the scene. Their artillery is still operational in the rear, but they have no way to call it or even know that it's still operational. The rain has wrecked the radios. They must withdraw, but that's when it all really goes to hell. Escaping along the roads is not an option. It must be cross-country. There is no more testing military maneuver than disengagement in the face of the enemy. The Americans were softened by years of inadequate training and military neglect, bewildered by the shock of combat, dismayed by the readiness with which the communists had overwhelmed them, and the isolation in which they found themselves. The plan is for units to leapfrog each other to defend as they pull back, but it pretty quickly turns into every man for himself. Smith goes to see what's left of the artillery and is surprised to find the guns just fine and only 2 men wounded, one of them being Colonel Perry, who runs the artillery. Smith and Perry head out, and they do manage to find some of their infantry arriving in Chonan the 6th with 185 men. The C Company commander comes in later that day with another 65. There are stragglers that turn up here and there over the rest of the whole week and the beginning of the next. By the 5th, though, the rest of Dean's 24th Division is deploying. The 34th Infantry is the next to face the NKPA. They are nearly 2,000 men strong, but with no armor or anti-tank weaponry. It was no more prepared in mind, training, or equipment to arrest the North Korean advance than Task Force Smith. But Dean could only give its commander the most straightforward of orders, to deploy his men in blocking positions at key routes southwards, at Ansong and Pyeongtaek. It was to these positions, late on the night of the 5th of July, that the stragglers and survivors of Task Force Smith began to drift in, bearing their bleak and confused tale of being overrun by a communist armored host. Holding the line from Pyeongtaek to Ansong, as Dean would like, would be a good thing. Looking at the map, an estuary from the Yellow Sea nearly reaches Pyeongtaek, so the flank of a defending force is covered. And the mountains come close east of Ansong, so that is too. South of this line, there are a lot more roads, and blocking or delaying the west of Korea becomes a lot harder. But if Dean really expects one battalion with no artillery or anti-tank weapons to hold back the enemy, for that's what he has at Pyeongtaek, he is expecting too much. 24th Division has almost a total lack of communications. The telephone wires keep getting cut, and the mountains and the distances play havoc with the radios. 1st Battalion, 34th Infantry, are hit by the Koreans early the 6th. They have blown the bridge north of Pyeongtaek, which halts the enemy tanks for the moment, but the mass of arriving infantry crosses the stream. The Americans are soon in full retreat towards Chonan, which they reach by evening, to avoid being left isolated and exposed by the enemy. It's a bit more than full retreat, though. Here's Michael Hickey's description. The North Korean tanks gave covering fire as their infantry poured forward and around the defenders' flanks. Men were soon moving back from the forward platoon positions, some without their packs and many without their weapons. Panic quickly set in. Many of the men ran all the way to Pyeongtaek, 3 miles down the road, where they gathered in a shambling crowd. One officer later tried to analyze the collapse of his platoon. Out of 31 men, 12 told him that their rifles would not fire. This, he found, was because they had seldom been cleaned and oiled, and the night's rain had rusted the mechanisms. Some men had tried to clean their weapons, but did not know how to strip them down or reassemble them. Well, at Pyeongtaek, they joined the 2 battalions of the 21st that were not with Task Force Smith, and have finally arrived in defensive positions. The 3rd Battalion, 34th Infantry arrives from Ansong as well. They head north the 7th, but get a message dropped by liaison plane that says, "Proceed with greatest caution. Large number of troops on your east and west flanks. Near Ansong, lots of tanks and trucks. Large concentration of troops trying to flank your unit." Soon enough, 3rd Battalion abandons their positions. Thing is, no one can reasonably expect them and the others to not have to withdraw. It's obvious they cannot hold back the enemy tide. But they withdraw without inflicting any real damage on the enemy. This is unacceptable to Dean. But there's not much he can do other than begin what becomes a series of sackings of his commanders. The enemy arrives in force that night at Chonan, penetrating the town at 6 a.m. the 8th, cutting off 2 rifle companies and killing Colonel Martin, the brand new commander of 34th Infantry. Enemy tanks arrive, and the fight gets bloodier, and it becomes a question of whether any of the Americans in the rapidly thinning force at all would escape being killed here. But an artillery screen allows at least some of them to get out. The afternoon of the 8th, 175 men of the 3rd Battalion are counted. That's all that's left of it. South of Chonan, there are 2 roads that go to Taejon. They both must be defended. Dean orders the 24th Division to head for a main battle position on the south bank of the Cam River, fighting delaying actions all the way, and they I will cover next week. So that is what happens to the American forces this week. They get completely beaten, overwhelmed even by North Korean forces with superior numbers, superior weapons, superior everything. At the start of the Korean War, the Americans paid the high price extracted from any liberal democracy whose politicians have decided there are no votes in defense. The malaise from which these troops were suffering was due to the post-1945 reaction against anything savoring of militarism or seen as preparation for further conflict. They went into action early in July 1950, ill-disciplined, physically soft, and dangerously undertrained in even basic infantry skill. Again, this American force is part of the occupation force in Japan, right? Well, in Japan, That force does not do battle drill practice, or physical training or games, or long marches, and they are neither physically nor mentally prepared for the combat they face this week. They are striking the first blow for the United Nations, which is something, but the North Koreans, they see the American troops and they're like, what are these guys doing here? North Korean command does not expect the Americans or anyone other than Koreans to be in their path. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung wouldn't have attacked in the first place if he did. What about those expected Koreans, though? The South Korean army? Well, after the loss of Seoul, they have been trying to reorganize. By this week, the ROK, that's the South, has at least partially succeeded and has some 68,000 men. General Chung Il-kwon arrives from Tokyo to replace Chai Byung-duk as chief of staff. MacArthur thinks parts of 1st and 7th divisions might be salvageable. Parts of 5th are at Yeongdong-po, across the river from Seoul. The capital division is around Incheon. In the far east, the 8th division is withdrawing, as we saw last week, and the 6th is south of Chuncheon and heading for Wonju. One regiment of the ROK 3rd Division, the 23rd, has moved from Pusan up to Uljin to try to block any enemy advance down the East Coast Road. Once the U.S. 24th Division enters the fray, the 5th, the ROK Army is defending everything east of the Seoul-Daegu Railroad and Highway, and their disorganization means they are fighting separate regimental actions. Meanwhile, the North Koreans began crossing the Han River late last week. It was the 3rd Division, the first to enter Seoul, that was first to cross. They started sending regiments across the 30th, but they were unable to penetrate far nor take Yeongdong-po and its industry. The North Korean 4th Division made its assault crossing beginning the 1st, and the fight for Yeongdong-po continued into the start of this week. After bloody close combat, it falls the morning of the 3rd. Now, the North Koreans don't use any tanks here, which might explain why the resistance is so strong, and also why the North has over 2,000 men killed and wounded here. But by the morning of the 4th, both 3rd and 4th Divisions, two of North Korea's finest, are all set to drive southward along the country's main railway and highway axis. It is they who run over the Americans the rest of the week. ROK headquarters are forced to evacuate Suwon the 4th by the enemy advance. The North Korean 1st and 2nd Divisions are also advancing, though today, as the week ends, a battalion of the 2nd are ambushed by ROK forces, who shatter it and capture 4 artillery pieces and 27 vehicles. 2nd is to join with 3rd and 4th in converging attacks on Taejon. North Korean 7th Division is advancing down the central corridor of the country, and ROK 6th Division is retiring before it, but causing heavy casualties. 7th does take Wonju midweek, but then 7th is redesignated 12th Division, and a new 7th Division is activated. ROK 8th Division is concentrating in the Tanyang area of the upper Han River. That's on the ground, but there is a war in the skies as well. Just after the invasion began, American air units were relocating to Japanese bases nearer Korea, and their air actions began the 26th. American fighter planes covered the evacuation of foreign nationals the 27th, shooting down 7 Yak-3 planes around Seoul and Incheon. The American Far East Air Forces really start getting busy. The 5th Air Force flying 172 combat sorties to 28th, supporting the ROK Army. However, on July 2nd, Task Force Smith witnesses 4 Mustangs flown by Australian pilots destroy a northbound ROK ammunition train and the train station at Pyeongtaek. They also kill a fair number of the town's residents. There is also friendly fire that day at Suwon. 5 times that day, according to one KMAG officer. KMAG is the American military advisors to Korea. He says they hit ammo dumps, gas dumps, trains, you name it. Apparently 4 American planes also strafe a column of South Korean trucks and kill some 200 ROK troops. Church demands that all United Nations air action be limited to north of the Han River, no matter that North Korean troops are advancing south of it. Aerial attacks on ROK troops have been a real problem, but on July 3rd, 2 tactical air control parties finally arrive, go into action the 5th. That is going to be a big help. Naval forces have been shelling the North Koreans since American cruiser Juno began doing so June 29. And this week, MacArthur begins implementing the order for a naval blockade he's gotten from Washington. There are 3 blockade groups: an East Coast group with American command, a West Coast group with British command, and a southern one under ROK Naval Command. North Korean shipping convoys start taking naval fire this week and getting sunk, and the first United Nations carrier strike is this week on the 3rd, with planes from U.S. Valley Forge and British Triumph against North Korean airfields west of Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. 2 Koreas, with both governments wanting reunification. A couple weeks ago, I talked about the formation of UNCOK, a UN commission to work for Korean reunification, in late 1948, and the withdrawal of Soviet and American forces from Korea. I'd like to say a few words now about some of what was happening just around that time, particularly with reference to South Korean President Syngman Rhee. See, General John Hodge, commanding U.S. 24th Corps, was commanding general of U.S. forces in Korea from September 1945, the occupation forces south of the 38th parallel. The following couple years were pretty chaotic times, and Rhee was allowed to return to Korea from exile, and Hodge hoped he could make some sense of the chaos. Rhee was originally named Yi Sung-man, and all the way back around the turn of the century, he had several run-ins with Korean imperial authorities, served time in prison, and went into exile in the U.S., changing his name to the more Western Syngman Rhee. He returned to Korea in 1910, but fled again to the States in 1919 after the March 1st independence rallies against the by-then Japanese rule were violently suppressed. The Korean Provisional Government, KPG, was then set up in Shanghai. Rhee was one of the founders. I don't think I need to say, though I will, that he is fiercely patriotic towards Korea. There's a lot to talk about with Hodge, Rhee, the post-war occupation, and the chaos, and I'll gradually cover it along with the active war as the weeks unfold. I just want to get to one thing here. Many of the main members of the KDG left Korea during Japanese rule or had collaborated with the Japanese. But the opposition groups, all of whom had actively opposed the Japanese and many individuals of whom were resistance heroes, were not at all well organized. These were the communist people's committees, the trade unions, and so forth. So you can see right there a fundamental divergence in views between Rhee and North Korean Communist leader Kim Il-sung, the latter a hero of the resistance against the Japanese in the 1930s, who has, since this war began, been calling on the radio for the people's committees to be restored in the South and Rhee to be executed. The South Korean National Police, KNP, who had quite a few officers who served in the Japanese secret police, pretty brutally put down left-wing groups in the South. Rhee set up an interim parliament, okay, but the communists in the South began to attract ever more support, with historically predictable results. Alarming reports from neutral observers, missionaries, and expatriate welfare workers confirmed the emergence of a brutal police state. A number of militant right-wing youth groups were allowed to flourish, many of whose members were refugees from the North. They were energetically resisted by equally extreme left-wing groups, which, if caught on the streets by the KNP, were savagely dealt with. By 1948, even as both Kim's North and Rhee's South are proclaiming their independent states, guerrilla war is pretty widespread in both of them against their regimes, to which both respond with excessive force, which leads to things like outright mutinies in the South Korean constabulary and frequent cross-border raids by both North and South in 1949. Rhee outlaws the Communist Party in the South already in 1948, and his government passes laws giving its forces the right to detain people without trial and to pass summary judgments on them. So the American CIA might not have been entirely off the mark when they referred to Rhee and company as essentially demagogues bent on autocratic rule. But this is who the Americans have had to work with. That's it, since Hodge backed him at the start with the best intentions in mind. Without Rhee, it would be just a vacuum, and there was no one other than the communists to fill it. And if you think people like the American rabid anti-communist Senator Joe McCarthy, who's recently risen to national fame, would allow that, then you are not thinking. So Rhee has had continued support, but his constant, unyielding crusading for a South Korean invasion of the North has caused the US to repeatedly refuse his requests for things like tanks and heavy artillery, even as the Soviets have been supplying the North. Which leads to what happens this week in the field, which I will sum up to end today in the words of Max Hastings. The North Korean invaders swept all before them on their bloody procession south down the peninsula, and all this flowed inexorably from the sudden decision of the United States to commit itself to the least expected of wars, in the least predicted of places, under the most unfavorable possible military conditions. But committed to this war they are, as are we at Time Ghost. And it is the Time Ghost Army that gives us the resources we need to do this conflict justice. You can join the army, join us, at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. And do not forget to subscribe. I'll see you next week.